One clause ended her game. In a single moment, my aunt's victory turned to ash. She thought she had won. She thought Grandma's house, the money, all of it was hers. But that single sentence in Grandma's will cost her everything. What she lost wasn't just the inheritance. She also lost her illusion of an easy win. She couldn't pretend her forged will was real anymore. She couldn't keep living in Grandma's house, and she couldn't escape the consequences that followed. I found out my grandmother had changed her mind about me on the same afternoon we buried her. At least, that was the story my Aunt Carol tried to sell everyone. Grandma Ruth's service was small and quiet, just like she always said she wanted. A few relatives, some church ladies, neighbours from her street. After the last hymn, the funeral director herded us into a side room he called the family conference room. Long table, bad coffee, a box of tissues sitting in the middle like a centerpiece. That's where I saw it. A thick navy folder sitting right in front of my aunt. Carol took the seat at the head of the table, even though she was the youngest of the three sisters. Her hands rested on the folder, fingers spread like she was pinning it down. Her eyes were red, but behind the puffiness there was this sharp, alert brightness I'd seen before. The look she got whenever money came up. "Thank you all for being here," she began, voice trembling just enough. Mum wanted things to be simple, no drama, just clarity. She nudged the folder toward the grey-haired man beside her. "This is Mr. Glenn. Mum updated her will with his office last year." Updated. The word sat heavy in my chest. My grandmother had never been mysterious about what she wanted. One summer in her kitchen, flour on her hands, she'd tapped a blue binder on the counter and told me, "If I leave anything behind, it's not so you all can hire lawyers and scream at each other. I want it clear, so you don't have to guess what I wanted. It's all written down." She'd said it like the matter was settled. Now, apparently, it wasn't. Mr. Glenn started to read. Legal boilerplate at first. Full name, being of sound mind, all the usual phrases. I folded my hands in my lap and tried to breathe. Maybe she had just rearranged a few things. People are allowed to change their minds. Then he reached the section about distribution. "I hereby leave my residence at 214 Oakwood, along with all furnishings and contents therein, to my daughter, Carol Mason. I leave the remainder of my savings accounts, certificates of deposit, and investments to my daughter Carol, to be used at her sole discretion." He kept going. My name did not come up. My mother, dead 10 years now, got a passing mention. I, the granddaughter who spent weekends driving Grandma to appointments when Carol couldn't get away, appeared once near the end, tied to my costume jewellery box and any personal mementos Carol deems appropriate to pass on. That was it. After decades of sleepovers, holidays, and grocery runs, I had apparently earned the right to whatever knickknacks my aunt felt like tossing my way. Across the table, Carol sniffled delicately. "She knew you always loved her necklaces, Laura," she murmured, as if that explained why my grandmother had supposedly handed her the house, the accounts, everything. I stared at my folded hands until the room stopped spinning. It wasn't that I expected to be made rich. Grandma's house was modest. Her savings, comfortable, but not huge. What hurt was the way this document erased the woman I knew and replaced her with someone else. Someone who would reward the loudest complainer and leave everyone else with scraps. When Mr. Glenn finished, the room went thick and quiet. A cousin patted my shoulder and said, "She knew you loved her, and that's what matters." In that tone people use when they really mean, "Don't start anything." So I didn't. Not there. Not in a room full of families still in black. But later, at my own kitchen table with cold coffee in front of me, I replayed every conversation I'd ever had with my grandmother about that blue binder. "Everything's in order," she'd told me months earlier. "I even met with a lawyer downtown. No surprises." If she'd already put everything in order with a lawyer she trusted, why did this stranger suddenly appear with a brand new will that gave Carol almost everything? Suspicion isn't evidence. Hurt feelings definitely aren't. I told myself that on repeat for 2 days. Then I called Carol and asked for a copy of the will. Carol hesitated when I asked for a copy of the will. "The lawyer has the original," she said. "Why do you need one? It's straightforward." "Because my name is in it," I answered, "and because grown adults are allowed to read documents that affect them. I'm not trying to start a fight, Carol. I just want to understand." A long, sharp pause. Then she exhaled. "Fine. I'll have Mr. Glenn's office email it to you." The PDF arrived an hour later. I printed it, hole-punched it out of habit, and laid it flat on my kitchen table. This time, I didn't half listen. I didn't skim. I read. The date on the last page stopped me cold. The will had been signed 6 days before my grandmother died. 6 days before she died, Grandma was in the ICU, drifting in and out of consciousness, hooked up to machines. I'd sat next to her bed, reading the church bulletin while she squeezed my hand. Nobody asked me to leave for a private legal meeting. Nobody mentioned a lawyer. I looked at the signature under that date. Ruth Ann Miller, in wobbly cursive. Her handwriting had gotten shakier over the years, but some things never changed. The little loop on her capital R, the way her double L's leaned forward like they were in a hurry. On this so-called signature, the R was big and clumsy. The L's stood straight up like fence posts. Most people would see old, shaky handwriting and move on. I saw my grandmother's name wearing somebody else's shoes. I picked up my phone and called the ICU nurse station. My voice dropped into that careful tone people use when they're trying not to accuse anyone. I gave them Grandma's full name, the dates, and then asked the question that had been chewing a hole in my stomach. Was she awake enough that last week to sit up and sign legal documents? The nurse put me on a brief hold. I listened to the faint, tinny music over the line. Beep. Click. When she came back, she sounded certain. In that final stretch? No, she was barely responsive. Maybe a squeeze of the hand, a word or two. Nothing like what you're describing. And we didn't have any attorneys or notaries come through for her. Someone like that would have had to check in with us. When I hung up, my kitchen felt colder. The laminate table under my hands suddenly felt like an evidence board. I had a questionable date, a strange signature, and a nurse who swore no lawyer ever showed up. Suspicion still wasn't evidence, but it was getting louder. A week later, I was sitting across from a probate attorney named James Porter. His office smelled like coffee and old paper. Files were stacked everywhere. He had the kind of tired eyes you only get from watching families fight over the dead for a living. "I'm sorry about your grandmother," he said, scanning the copy of the will. "Tell me what doesn't sit right." I told him everything. Grandma's obsession with putting things in order, the blue binder, the way she'd bragged about meeting a lawyer downtown to make sure there were no surprises. Carol's sudden control over the funeral, the ICU timeline, the signature that looked like someone trying on her handwriting for size. Porter listened, pen tapping against his legal pad. "People do change their wills," he said finally. "Sometimes in ways that hurt feelings. That's not illegal." He looked up at me. "What worries me is capacity and execution. If she didn't understand what she was signing, or physically couldn't, that's a problem. If the signature isn't hers at all, that's something else entirely. He explained what a challenge would look like. We'd need medical records, a handwriting expert, testimony about who was actually present. And then he asked the question that shifted everything. "You mentioned a lawyer downtown," he said. "Did she ever show you any of his paperwork? A letter? A business card? Anything?" I pictured that blue binder again, the neat tabs, one of them labelled "legal" in her careful block letters. "I didn't pay attention at the time," I admitted. "I just remember her saying she was relieved it was done. She said, 'It's all written down so you kids don't have to fight.'" Porter nodded slowly. "If there's an older will sitting in some file cabinet downtown, and she never revoked it, that document could change everything." When I walked out of his office, my grief had a new shape. It wasn't just loss anymore. It was a puzzle. Somewhere in this mess, buried in paper and fine print, my grandmother's real voice was still waiting to be found. 2 days later, I was back in my grandmother's house. The casseroles were gone. The sympathy cards were stacked in a neat little pile. But the place already felt less like hers and more like a project my aunt was managing. Closets were half empty. Drawers hung open. Trash bags full of clothes leaned against the hallway walls. Carol stood in the living room, hands on her hips, surveying it all like a foreman. "I've taken care of most of the paperwork," she said when I asked about the blue binder. "It was a disaster. You don't need to worry about all that." "I'd still like to see it," I said. "For my own records." Her mouth tightened. "Laura, why are you making this harder? Mum trusted me with this. She knew I'd handle things." She turned away before I could answer. The conversation was over, at least in her mind. I left without the binder, but not empty-handed. A few weeks earlier, before the hospital stays, I'd grabbed a couple of boxes of Grandma's mail to go through later. They were still sitting in my garage. That night, I dragged them into the living room and dumped the contents out on the floor. Old utility bills, church newsletters, flyers, envelopes from insurance companies. I made piles until my back ached. Halfway through the second box, I saw it. An envelope with a downtown address and a law firm name on the corner. The letter inside was short, formal. It confirmed that her estate planning documents had been executed and that the originals would be stored at their office. The letterhead read, "Daniel and Hurst, Attorneys at Law." My hands shook a little as I dialed the number. The receptionist put me on hold, then transferred me. Click. Beep. A calm, male voice came on the line. "This is Robert Daniels." I told him my grandmother's name, told him she had passed away, told him there was a newer will from a different attorney that didn't sound like her at all. He was quiet for a moment. I could hear papers rustling on his end. "Yes," he said finally. "We drafted a will for Ms. Ruth Ann Miller about 4 years ago. I have no record of it being revoked or replaced through our office." My throat tightened. "Is there any way I can see it?" "If you bring a copy of the death certificate, we can review it together," he said. "I remember her. She was very particular about how she wanted things." His office was small, lined with filing cabinets. No sleek conference room, no designer chairs, just an aging desk, a coffee maker in the corner, and shelves full of other people's unfinished business. He pulled a folder labelled Miller, Ruth Ann, and laid a thick document in front of me. It looked right before I even read a word. The formatting, the witnesses, the notary seal. And then, at the bottom, her signature, the real one, the capital R with the looping flourish, the forward-leaning double L's like they were hurrying off the page. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until I heard myself let it out. Daniels walked me through the main points. The house was to be sold. The proceeds split among her 3 daughters. A portion set aside for a small scholarship at the community college. Her accounts divided in percentages between her children and a few modest gifts to grandkids, including me. It wasn't extravagant. It was fair. It sounded exactly like the woman who looked me in the eye and said, "No fighting." Then he tapped a paragraph in the middle of the will. "She was especially insistent about this part," he said. "She'd heard some ugly family stories. She wanted to discourage any creative behavior after she was gone." I leaned in and read. In plain English, it said that if any beneficiary engaged in fraud, forgery, or contested the will in bad faith, they would be treated as if they had died before her. Their share would be redistributed to the remaining beneficiaries and to the charity she'd named. It was a no-contest clause with teeth. In other words, Daniels said gently, if the court finds someone tried to cheat, they don't get anything. The will acts like they aren't there. I swallowed. That sounds exactly like her. He nodded. She wanted her wishes respected. She wanted to make sure nobody could rewrite them after she couldn't speak for herself. I thought about Carol at the funeral, the navy folder, the shaky signature that wasn't quite right. The way she'd said, Mum updated her will, like the verdict had already been delivered. What happens, I asked quietly, if someone presents a forged will to try to override this one? Daniels folded his hands. If the court determines there was fraud, he said, that's serious on its own. And under this clause, the person responsible would almost certainly be treated as having forfeited their share. I stared down at the paragraph again. One paragraph, a few lines of text, sitting in the middle of a stack of paper. So, they'd basically write themselves out of the will, I said. In effect, he replied. Yes. When I stepped back out onto the sidewalk, the air felt different, brighter, heavier. For the first time since the funeral, I didn't feel crazy. I felt like my grandmother had been quietly waiting for me in a filing cabinet downtown all along. She hadn't changed her mind about me. She'd done exactly what she said she would do, put everything in writing, and left a trap for whoever tried to use her death as a chance to grab more than their share. That night, I spread both wills out on my dining table. On the left, Grandma's real will from Daniel's office, neat, measured, fair. On the right, the shaky, last-minute miracle my aunt had marched in with. Same woman's name at the bottom. 2 different stories. My husband stood at the other end of the table, hands in his pockets. He didn't touch either document. He just looked at me. If you push this, he said softly, Carol will never forgive you. I watched the lamplight shine off the notary seal on Grandma's real will. She forged our grandmother's name, I said. I'm just deciding whether I'm going to pretend not to see it. For a while, I sat with the ugliest question. Was I doing this for justice or for money? It would be easier in some ways to swallow my pride, let Carol keep the house, and tell myself, it's just stuff. Families have ended over less. But every time I thought about letting it go, I heard Grandma's voice in my head, tapping that blue binder. I want it clear, so you don't have to guess what I wanted. If I walked away now, I wasn't being noble. I was letting someone commit fraud on my grandmother's entire life. I was letting Carol rewrite the ending because it was easier not to argue. The next morning, I called James Porter. My voice didn't shake this time. I want to challenge the newer will, I said. I want the court to admit Mr. Daniels's will instead, and I want the truth on the record. Porter didn't sound surprised. "All right," he said. "It won't be pleasant, but with Daniels, the medical records, and a handwriting expert, you have a strong case, and that no contest clause your grandmother insisted on." He let the thought hang. "Let's just say your aunt picked the wrong will to mess with." Probate court isn't glamorous. No jury box, no grand speeches, just a tired judge in a black robe, a handful of lawyers, and families who don't look at each other unless they have to. On the morning of our hearing, case number 90431 flickered onto the little digital docket outside the courtroom door. Carol arrived in a black dress and a string of Grandma's pearls. She clutched a tissue in one hand and the navy folder in the other. She wouldn't look at me at first. When she finally did, her eyes were glassy with a kind of wounded outrage. She leaned closer and hissed under her breath, "You're destroying this family. For what? A bigger check?" I could have said a lot of things. I could have reminded her who drove Grandma to all those appointments when she was too busy. I could have asked how much she thought Grandma's signature was worth. Instead, I kept my voice low. "I'm not the one who forged her name," I said. "I'm just the one who refused to pretend it was real." Her face went pale. She turned away, like she could walk out of the conversation if she refused to hear it. Inside the courtroom, everything felt smaller. No stained glass, no flowers, just wood, fluorescent lights, and the quiet shuffle of other people's grief being catalogued and scheduled. The judge called our case. We took our seats. Carol on one side with her attorney and the will from Mr. Glenn's office. Me on the other, with Porter and a folder of our own. Mine didn't look as impressive, but it contained something far more dangerous than a shaky signature. Carol's lawyer went first. He talked about sacrifice. About how Carol had been the one on the ground, caring for her mother. How Grandma had supposedly realized her original plan was unfair and wanted to make it right by leaving most of the estate to the daughter who did the most. If you didn't know the rest, it almost sounded reasonable. Then it was our turn. Porter's voice stayed calm. No theatrics, just facts. He submitted Grandma's medical records from the last week of her life. He pointed to the notes about her being minimally responsive, unable to follow complex conversations. The ICU nurse testified by video. She confirmed what she'd told me. No attorney, no notary, no formal signing in that room 6 days before my grandmother died. A handwriting expert took the stand next. He'd examined Grandma's known signatures, checks, birthday cards, the will from Daniel's office, and compared them to the one on Carol's updated document. "In my professional opinion," he told the judge, "the signature on the later document is highly inconsistent with Ms. Miller's genuine handwriting. It shows signs of slow, deliberate drawing rather than natural signing." Finally, one of the supposed witnesses to the newer will was called. A man in his 50s, nervous, twisting his hat in his hands. Under oath, his story unravelled. "I never met her mother," he admitted. "Carol just brought me a document already signed and said she needed witnesses on file. I signed where she pointed." By the time Porter called Robert Daniels and handed the judge Grandma's original will, the air in the room had changed. Even the clerk, who'd been half dozing, was sitting up straighter. The judge flipped through the older document, pausing here and there, eyebrows knitting. Carol stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, as if refusing to look down could keep the pages from existing. The judge shuffled the two wills for a long time, the newer, shaky one on top, the older, cleaner one underneath. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, but there was nothing casual about it. "This court finds," he began, that the document dated 6 days prior to Ms. Miller's death does not meet the requirements of a valid will. He looked over his glasses at Carol. There is insufficient evidence that she had the capacity to execute it. The testimony regarding its execution is inconsistent. And the expert testimony regarding the signature raises serious concerns about its authenticity. He set the updated will aside like it was just another piece of scrap paper. However, he continued, lifting the older document, there is a properly executed will, signed 4 years earlier, with no credible evidence of revocation. The court therefore admits this will to probate as the last will and testament of Ruth Ann Miller. Across the aisle, I heard a soft, choked sound. Carol. That's not fair, she blurted before her lawyer could stop her. I took care of her. I was there every day. Mum wanted to make it right. She told me, Ms. Mason, the judge cut in, this is about documents and the law, not about who visited more often. Porter stood. His tone stayed measured. Your Honour, in light of the court's findings regarding the fraudulent document, we respectfully ask the court to address the no contest clause in the admitted will. The judge flipped to the middle of Grandma's real will. His finger landed on the paragraph Daniels had shown me. He read it aloud, in calm, even syllables. Any beneficiary who engaged in fraud, forgery, or contested the will in bad faith would be treated as if they had died before her. Their share would be redistributed to the remaining beneficiaries and to the named charity. It sounded almost gentle on the page. It did not feel gentle in that room. Under the laws of this state, the judge said, such a clause is enforceable when the court finds that a beneficiary has acted in bad faith. He looked at Carol again. This time he didn't look away. Based on the evidence presented, this court finds that you attempted to introduce a fraudulent document in an effort to override your mother's valid estate plan and direct the bulk of assets to yourself. Carol's hand flew to her mouth. Her lawyer whispered her name, but she didn't seem to hear him. She just shook her head, eyes wide, as if she could rewind the last 10 minutes by sheer force of denial. Accordingly, the judge went on, under the terms of the will your mother signed, you will be treated as having predeceased her for purposes of distribution. He spoke the words slowly, like a verdict, dropping one brick at a time. You will not take under this will. Your share will be redistributed among the remaining beneficiaries and the named charity. For a heartbeat, the only sound in the courtroom was the low hum of the air conditioner. Then Carol found her voice. You can't do this? She whispered. I did everything for her. The judge's reply was quiet. Honoring someone's wishes does not include faking their signature, he said. Your mother planned for this. She made her wishes clear in writing. This court is simply enforcing them. He added, almost as an afterthought, that the matter of the forged document would be referred to the district attorney's office for review. Then he called the next case. Just like that, it was over. Years of my grandmother's saving, worrying, planning, months of Carol's scheming, all turned by one paragraph most people would have skimmed past. In the weeks that followed, the family did what families do. Some cousins called to say they were proud of me. Others left tight little voicemails about airing dirty laundry and ruining Carol's life. Carol herself never called at all. At the next wedding, she stood on the far side of the room, laughing too loudly, wearing a necklace that wasn't Grandma's for the first time in years. There were moments, alone in my kitchen, when I asked myself if it had been worth it. If I should have just swallowed the insult and let her keep the house to keep the peace. Then I'd picture my grandmother sitting in that cramped office at Daniel and Hurst, carefully initialing each page, insisting on that one clause because she'd seen too many people tear each other apart over stuff. She hadn't written that paragraph so we could all be friends. She'd written it so we'd have to live with what we chose. When my share of the estate finally came through, it didn't transform my life. It paid off the last of our debt. It padded our savings. And it left enough for one thing I knew would have made her smile. With Mr. Daniel's help, I worked with the community college to set up a small scholarship in her name for older students going back to school. People like her, who'd always wanted a second chance at an education. Standing in the financial aid office, signing the paperwork, I felt something loosen in my chest. The director said, "Your grandmother sounds like she was quite a woman." "She was," I said, "and she was very serious about putting things in writing. At home, in my own hallway, there's a shelf where her blue binder used to sit. In its place, I keep a new one with my handwriting on the spine. Estate and legal. Inside are copies of everything: her real will, the court order, the scholarship documents. Right in the middle, in a plastic sleeve, is a photocopy of that no contest clause. Sometimes, when the house is quiet, I take it out and read it again. Not because I need the legal language, but because of what it represents. A line my grandmother drew years ago, trusting that someone would respect it when she couldn't enforce it herself. My aunt thought she could steal my grandmother's legacy with a forged signature and a cooperative lawyer. She thought she could erase a lifetime of planning in one afternoon, in a conference room that smelled like bad coffee and grief. In the end, it wasn't my anger that stopped her. It wasn't a screaming match in the driveway. It wasn't some dramatic confrontation at the funeral. It was one quiet clause in the middle of a will she never bothered to read carefully. Documents don't play favourites. They don't care who cries hardest, or who says family first the loudest. They just say what they say. My aunt tried to write me out of my grandmother's story. All I did was follow the paper trail, walk into court, and make sure my grandmother's own words got the final say.